So can I invite our first panel talk for today? It's going to be moderated by Jane Perrone, and her panellists are Giacomo Guzon, Dr. Gemma Jerome, and Adam Hunt.
I'll sit next to you.
Well, this is nice. I hope you can hear me. I'm Jane Perrone, and normally I'm sat at home speaking into a microphone with only my dog for an audience as I record my podcast. So it's delightful to be here with my panellists and with you, and also with those joining us on the live stream. And I'm really excited to get into this discussion. I'm not going to do long introductions of my three panellists because you can all read the bios, but we have Adam Hunt here from Urquhart & Hunt. Looking forward to hearing about your Chelsea experiences, Adam. Giacomo Guzon, who is a landscape designer and also a tutor in this area, and Dr. Gemma Jerome from Building with Nature, and you can tell us a bit more about what Building with Nature does as we go. I wanted just to start, though, by reflecting on the way that already public perceptions about rewilding and biodiversity schemes are changing. And this is something that's come up in one of the delegate questions. One of the delegates was asking, how do we involve communities based in other cultures who may connect differently and have different associations with terms like wild and nature? I know this is something that's all of you have thought deeply about. Who wants to start? Giacomo.
Okay, I can start. I think there is definitely a change in the last, I've been working now for 8 years, so if I think back 8 years ago, it definitely was a more formal approach, even in an urban environment, that people will see a park or a garden had to be kind of tidy, and tidy, is not an easy term. Who is tidy for, and what is tidy? But I think there's definitely more perception and acceptance, and also respect for landscapes that are maybe less formal, maybe less pruned, and it comes down to people respecting it. So I think the conversation with the community is a big part of what we need to do, probably more, convey the message, maybe it's okay that the planting or a landscape doesn't look tidy and pruned, and the shrubs are all kind of pruned in both shapes, because that was the common thing what you will see in public landscapes. So I think definitely is a shift from that. And I think through the public consultation, for instance, public projects, we got a lot of feedback from the community, what they wanted, but also we tried to kind of explain what we wanted to create, or maybe moving away from a landscape that was too tidy. And the perception was very good. As I always say, a big demand is for color. They want color, they were engaging, but in terms of the planting to be tidy or not, I think is more also a shift from a developer client side, allowing that to happen. So I think that's also a shift from the community as well from the client. So I think we are definitely moving to the right direction. And we try our best to compromise between getting it wild and getting it respected. It's a fine balance between getting too wild and not respected, or it just it comes with maintenance and care and nurturing and communicating the message. I don't know.
Gemma, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really critical question. I think we need to be designing gardens and spaces actually for everyone. So a big part of what I do is support people to understand how to create accessible natural green spaces, which will include gardens, it will include public realm. And I think for me, hidden in the question is a clear understanding that depending on your social and cultural background, you'll have a different starting position as to what you're looking for from having an enjoyable time in nature and outdoors. And I think, we live in a really diverse society in the UK. And so as garden designers, as landscape professionals, we need to constantly be thinking about what of our own values are we bringing to the table when we're designing a space. And a key part of that is consultation, to make sure we're thinking about who we're actually creating a space for, so it is accessible, and that isn't just about physical access, it's about perceived and actual barriers to access as well. So there's such interesting research around this at the moment. A space people are probably really familiar with is the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. And a fellow of mine in the landscape research profession, Dr. Bridget Snaith, has recently published some of her doctorate findings around existing neighbourhoods close to that part of London, not actually feeling that their own desires for a garden are being reflected back in that design of the Olympic Park. So whilst it's been an incredible success in terms of getting people from across the country and the world to think differently about landscape, the people who are living right there, who will have that longevity of relationship, maybe now the design of some of those spaces needs to go on a different journey. And I think there's things around, if you're first generation community living in the UK, you might have a different relationship with wild space. You know, it might actually have negative connotations. So I think there's just a message here around landscape professionals being as sensitive and as listening as they can be when designing spaces. So kind of pride, imagination are really coming to the fore, and communities are able to feel that and see themselves reflected back in the spaces that we're creating. So it has that longevity of benefit, positive benefit for as many people as possible.
Adam, you were at the sharp end of public perceptions with your garden at Chelsea. Can you tell us something about that experience and how the garden was received?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I think in terms of nature and the wild, what we get from that, what people get from it is a sense of awe. So if you see 600 lapwings murmurating, or you see a flying V of geese, or even if you see a fox and it stops in the street and looks at you. And I think that thing, that response is an emotional response. And I'm not sure how generational or culturally different it is. I think it's one of awe. And I think this is why the term rewilding has caught such a feeling. And there was a deeply emotional response to our garden. It was surprising. And I'm not quite sure on what level or why that occurred, but there was an intimacy to it, and there was a sort of promise of what a keystone species might do left to its own devices. So I think that there's if you look at what happens in a lot of the inner city allotments, there's a really interesting dialogue, cross-cultural dialogue to be had around, in the case of allotments, obviously about food and growing vegetables, but also around what wild might look like. I mean, we took some North American visitors around our beaver rewilded garden, and they were incredibly underwhelmed because it was sort of, what's the story here? We got beavers everywhere. We've always had them. Why is this a thing? So that was quite an interesting. Because suddenly I was sort of really sort of wrong-footed. Mm. But yeah, I mean, I think, in a way, whatever, for us, we're meeting a lot of this nature for the first time. Mm. You know, there's a lot of people that we spoke to didn't even consider that the beaver was ever native. A lot of people think they eat fish, for example. You know, this is nature, some of the nature we're talking about, we're not familiar with anymore. You know, it's 400-500 years ago, generations ago that it was here. But that emotional response is one that I think we would really look for as a way to connect people.
Mm. And when we're talking about spaces, I think one of the differences might be between public spaces and private, more garden spaces where rewilding might be happening or biodiversity schemes might be happening at different levels. Does that entail different challenges and different aims when you're talking about those two different kinds of spaces? Giacomo.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, dealing with the public is a whole different story, I think. And for me as a plant geek is sometimes very painful because you have to accept some degree of destruction, which happens normally in the city. But I think is about what Adam was saying about the sensibility and the cultural background, talking with people. It just maybe sometimes even, you know, when we are doing the maintenance walk and we work with the gardeners, maybe having even a conversation with the people, trying to, you know, to get them on board. Because when people visit a garden and they make an effort in time and money to visit the garden sometimes, because it's maybe not in their neighborhood or so, they're already on board with the fact that, you know, they are going to a place where they have to respect or maybe, you know, get inspired. But maybe when it's a public space, people don't think that way. Maybe, you know, it's a given. And especially, I think maybe younger generation, teenagers and so on, maybe they don't think at that time that, you know, maybe they shouldn't drive with their bike through the planting just because they can. And there is not a fence there keeping them out, but they can make the choice not to bike through the planting. So I think is definitely, it comes with all sorts of different challenges, and that's the beauty of, I guess, of being a landscape architect, dealing with them and trying kind of to find a solution that works in this time, in 2022, with the resources we have, with the climate challenges we have, where we don't have rain for weeks. And but ultimately, I always try to find a conversation, you know, and often you know, I try not to tell them, you know, that I'm involved with that. You know, sometimes you do, and when you show people kind of the interest, you know, behind these and, you know, that planting or that plants, you know, they're kind of interested because you are kind of maybe raising their sensibility towards something that they were just seeing as a green blob. And then they can start picking things and say, oh, that's really interesting. But yet the challenges in the public are a whole different story, I imagine. I'm more involved in public landscape, so I'm sure there are challenges also. But in terms of the human pressure in the city, especially this summer, where we have had a very long summer with people really feeling a need for green spaces. They want to go out, they want to hang out under shade of trees. And of course, there are many of us, especially in London, you know, very concentrated in a few parks, so the pressure is huge. So dealing with that, managing with that, I'm not sure we are completely find out the best solution, but we are kind of working on it, trying to balance all the compromises and try to make it work and support the nature that we have in the city. Yeah, but giving also back to the community a park that they can use, because then you start to, if you are too prohibitional, so you are not allowing them to do anything, then it doesn't become an enjoyable landscape. So you see, it's kind of a difficult terrain in terms of finding a perfect solution to it. Yeah.
Gemma, do you want to come in there with some examples of projects that that might shed more light? I mean, I suppose the ultimate public space, when it's maybe somebody's street, is a great example of where it's very, very outside their front door, and perceptions may be very, very different than...
Yeah, for sure. So, lots to say on this question, I think. When I told my mother-in-law I was coming to a conference about rewilding, she very piffily texted me back, well, there's rewilding and there's just being bloody lazy. She was referring to, she lives in southeast London in Deptford. She only has a little balcony, but the council manage the area around her home. And you know, there is a move. I work a lot with local authorities and support them kind of internally with some training, either at the office level with the grounds team, to think about how actually to manage grass verges differently, because there is a lot of opportunity to do less maintenance and to often to great effect that can have an aesthetic. Well, I think the aesthetic bit is the bit that's in question. But what people are looking for from their local spaces. Where I live in Stroud, the town council have reduced their mowing in the public parks around the town, and they probably people have something similar in their local area, but they put a wooden blue heart in any areas that they're letting grow wild to to give people an indication that it hasn't just been left. They're not, you know, and to be slightly more serious, that, you know, it's not necessarily about a lack of desire or effort. It's austerity, and you know, there are serious cutbacks happening in local authorities, and they're having to manage more with less. So I think the issue of maintenance is really, really key in this question of public versus private, and how we design spaces, how we create spaces is the first challenge, but then how we implement them, you know, we need to do that right as well for them to actually deliver the functions and benefits that we want them to. But it's that the key question, and always the key puzzle, is how we can manage and maintain those spaces into the long term. Because often these areas that maybe are perceived as unkempt and unloved, maybe some of them actually have been managed and maintained with fewer resources or fewer skills than would be ideal. So I think there's a whole question in this debate around rewilding and moving towards a different way of designing and creating spaces that are for people and wildlife. There's a big question about how we upskill the sector. When I speak to local authority or kind of contracted out maintenance teams, they're just about getting their head around biodiversity net gain as a new kind of policy driver and a new requirement that's coming through in English planning system. But then what that actually means in terms of how they manage and maintain. Not every local authority has access to a Giacomo, a plant geek. You know, they really don't. So I think there's some challenges there. And then just before probably Adam would want to come in, the other thing that I think is really important in relation to this question, Jane, is again, thinking about public versus private and who has access and how do people access spaces. So I was recently reading Nick Hayes' book. Probably people in the audience have come across his work around trespassing. And, you know, he would say himself, he's repackaging a lot of knowledge and research for a new audience. But some of the key things that kind of jump out at you from the first few pages of his new book is that essentially we have access to in England, we have access to 8% of the land and 3% of the rivers. So if we're rewilding on the scale that I think we should be, Alistair, who then has access to that? And how do we ensure that the people who really, really are deprived, nature deprived, people who, it might be, we talked about social groups, but it might be class as much as ethnicity. I worked for a long time in Liverpool, and you know, there are children I worked with there. Liverpool's just on the Sefton coast, so the sea's there. Children who I worked with in Toxteth who'd never been to the sea, and when they go through the park, they keep on the path because they don't want to dirty their trainers. But you know, when I worked with them in a forest school setting, it took about 20 minutes and they were running off and picking blackberries. You know, we need to think about people with long-term health conditions, people who are living with the illness of addiction, people who, for their mental health, you know, people who have suffered trauma. There's amazing research which shows having access to nature settles their levels of cortisol and stress, and you know, really, we as a society as a whole, I think access is just again really, really key. And so when we talk about public and private, sometimes what can look public is actually private, and you can't get to it, and then you can't get all of those benefits. So yeah, just a couple of ideas.
Yeah. This ties into another question that's coming from a delegate about where do humans fit into these rewilded spaces, and should we be putting the wildlife first or the humans first? I guess it's not a binary answer there, Adam.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question because I think if we're talking about this as practitioners, in terms of designing public spaces, private spaces, and bringing on the principles of rewilding, we need to be considering habitat creation as a key design perimeter alongside design aesthetic levels, aspect, etc., etc. It's an important parameter, and it's one that I think everyone's finding their clients are asking for more and more. And if we're talking about it in terms of the public access, I think when we're looking at wild spaces, when we're looking at urban, bringing the wild into urban areas, we need to start thinking about it from the wildlife's point of view as well, which means looking at green corridors, looking at waterways, looking at parks. I mean, I was having a conversation with an architect the other day who was saying, how do we deal with these green deserts that a lot of our public parks have become? And if you look at the kind of planting, be it native or non-native, that encourages wildlife, is a more complex, multi-layered structural planting. And that also provides resilience in terms of climate change, carbon capture, in terms of water retention, and in terms of amenity, because you're looking at shade and amenity for wildlife as well, because you're looking at a more diverse range of habitat within it. So I think if we can start, I think the key thing for me is we are allowed to be in a conversation with nature. We are in a conversation with nature. And when we talk about keystone species, i.e. species around which a whole load of ecological outcomes occur, we are the ultimate keystone species. Unfortunately, compared with most other species, we have a power for good or bad. I was thinking about it the other day. I mean, maybe locusts could be considered quite a negative keystone species, you know, but I think, and so if we're designing and we're thinking, okay, what would a beaver do here? What would a bison do? What are those processes? Then maybe we're getting into that wild mindset where we're actually going, okay, we're part of this, but our imposition, as Dan was saying earlier, is less. It's more of a listening and a conversation.
One other question that came in concerned neglected urban parks, drawing on what you've just said there, asking about the best way to encourage and support community gardeners to take over neglected urban parks. We need people, we need volunteers. How does that happen in a way that chimes with the aims you're talking about there, Adam?
Wow. That's a political question, isn't it, that one? I mean, I think it has to happen. You know, it has to happen. I think that food security is a growing issue, and that links, of course, to land use and access to land. And a lot of young growers, be they horticulturalists or market gardeners, they're really struggling to get access to land, and communities are struggling to get access to land. And I mean, I'm not sure what I can personally do about it, but I think collectively it will gain momentum.
Gemma?
Yeah, this is a bit of a passion project of mine. My doctorate thesis was actually about communities working to, basically environmental stewards and volunteers looking after parks, alleyways, gardens in their local area in Merseyside, where I was based. And I'm not going to try and recite the whole 180,000 words for you. Nobody wants to hear that. But I think the key findings are that it's a partnership. It has to be a partnership approach. So at the time I was writing, it was in, without getting political, Adam, it was in kind of critical response to the big society idea that the coalition government were pushing at the time, the idea that you could just cut public sector funding and volunteers would do it on your behalf. Complete misunderstanding of why people volunteer. Often, you know, people who volunteer are vulnerable. They're at a vulnerable point in their life, or they're at a kind of later kind of chapter of their life. But ultimately, partnership approaches are more sustainable and actually honouring of the time, energy and enthusiasm that volunteers are giving. When I talk about partnership approaches, I mean anchor organisations working alongside volunteers. So social enterprises. There is an amazing network of social enterprises in this country who are rooted in communities of geography, communities of interest. They know intimately the strengths and needs of their local communities, and so they're well positioned to channel funding through and then facilitate and support a group of volunteers who want to work on the land. So whether that is a friends of group, whether it's less formal. I do think formal governance has an important role to play. What I found is the groups who are more formally constituted had more longevity, had more resilience, but ultimately having that kind of relationship with a body who understood the politics and the machinations of maybe funding or access to land better than the average volunteer group. There were always exceptions, so people where you had retired professionals running a friends group, they were often exceptions. But you know, organisations like the Mersey Forest in Merseyside had a really important role to play. Organisations like Squash in Liverpool, who I worked with for many years, who have been in that community for 15 years and taken a very diverse and a very deprived community on a journey over that time. They recently won the BBC Food and Farming Awards for their local community shop. People who started as volunteers in my garden are now kind of running groups themselves. And they have a plan for a 100-year street. So actually taking the vision of a group of volunteers, but having a kind of mix of skills and capacities in that group is really, really key. So yeah, I think people can be empowered, but I think it does, you can't underplay how the need for succession. If you don't do that, then people burn out, and then, you know, spaces that are taken over will kind of fall by the wayside because the pioneer of that group will kind of burn out and run out of steam. So
I think the leadership is needed, right, to make it work. Like friends of, we hear many kind of famous parks, they have the friends of the High Line, for instance. They go all in the spring and they cut down all the herbaceous. I think it requires definitely a set of rules and where people can tap in, because now someone has to drive it. I found this kind of occasion, they have a momentum, but if it's not like a leadership and organization kind of providing a frame, they kind of quickly kind of ease out and don't develop. So, but I think in cities, definitely human are part, to go back to the regional question, definitely are part of the equation. And as an landscape architect, creating spaces that are balancing humans and nature, that's a big challenge, which I'm faced every day. So I don't have the solution yet, but definitely is involving more. I think we all need to be involved. If we are going to green the cities, we all have to be part of it. Everyone has to be on board on small levels, like big levels, you know, their own front yard, their own terrace, as well as the public. But definitely, there's definitely room to involve more and create these bodies where people can, and some people have, especially in cities, I feel a real desire to garden on any level, really. But you get to get them kind of also, you have to give them a framework of kind of support that they need, you know, maybe tools, maybe, you know, get together. So I think it can work, but it needs kind of more than just, you know, a random group. So it requires a proper leadership, I feel.
Jane, just one extra thought, actually, building on Giacomo and Adam's comments about the human and nature. I wonder whether it's a false dichotomy, actually, that we kind of set this up that humans are apart from nature, and then, you know, even Builder in Nature, so Builder in Nature is a standards framework which supports landscape professionals, ecologists, and others involved in bringing new development forward to make sure they're creating for people and wildlife. So that's our kind of core mission. And it works, but I think there's something that you said, Adam, and you just touched on as well, Giacomo, around the emotion. And I would go, you know, one step further, maybe be so bold as to say it's a spiritual endeavor, often what we're doing, that actually, you know, bit of a double-edged sword, that if we as humans, as a species, we are one of many species, if we don't have a connection with nature, then we don't want to then protect, defend, enhance, because we haven't had that kind of moment where we feel we're part of this, you know, we're part of the whole. And I think outside of a Western ontology and maybe outside of our approach to garden design, I don't know, you two would be more expert on that than me, there's an understanding of that holistic, joined up, we are simply one species of many.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've forgotten that we're in that conversation.
Yeah.
We're still in that conversation, we just happen to be acting quite badly in it at the moment. And I had a friend who wanted me to help remove a shrub. It was a variegated Elaeagnus. And I said, no. He said, oh, come on, this was the other day. I said, no, there's a wren nesting in. There's a wren living there. That's a home. He said, no, it's a shrub. I don't want it there. And I said, look, I'm going to have to sit down and do a protest. I'm not having this. This is someone's home. It happens to be a non-human's home. But I think this, we don't know what we call it habitat, but it is homes, and a lot of our activity can create or destroy habitat. And I mean, that's the kind of conversation that we're in many instances, is destroying sources of food, destroying habitat. And I think just that slight change in mindset. So, for example, I don't know, if we were talking about it the other night, if we're building a wall and we use a soft mortar or we do a dry stone wall, we've immediately created habitat. If we use a really stiff mortar, 3-to-1 sand and cement, we're not creating habitat. And I mean, at our Chelsea garden, an expert came sort of about, I think it was day 3, and identified that we already had solitary bees nesting in our dry stone wall. It'll only be up 2 weeks. And we kept note of the dragonflies, the damselflies, the 7 different kinds of butterflies we got on that site. And you know what Chelsea's like. I mean, it is, the park is just a green wasteland after the show and pretty much before it. So, I mean, I think this thing about this conversation is allowing homes and habitat and food sources, or part of it anyway.
Yeah.
We've talked, obviously, everyone in this room, I'm sure, is on board, but we've talked about changing people's mindsets, and there is change happening, but how do we reach the people who really are resistant to this idea and begin to get some traction there? There are obviously communities who are hard to reach for lots of different reasons, ideologically, economically. When we get to the really gnarly challenges of this, what can we do? That's a tough one.
I think my instinct, and then straight to you, is, so when I worked as a garden designer, and I kind of feel a little bit like I'm at such a strategic level now. I still work with people, but less at the project level. But when I worked at the project level, you can kind of arrive to a project or a community, and a kind of project within that community, with a lot of prejudgments, a lot of assumptions about how somebody's, exactly as you said, Jane, you might have done your kind of data analysis and you've assumed what the needs of that community are. I mean, one of the things I always do very consciously is don't just talk about a community's needs, talk about their strengths, even if you think there are no strengths, because it's a green desert. All of their, all of their kind of access to nature is amenity grassland mown to within an inch of its life. There are still, people will still have special places. There'll be stories in that community. Well, that's where we do that every January, have a wassail there, or that's where we remembered that person. So it's something about that personal touch, I think, and arriving with an open mind and recognizing that. I'll go back to the example of the children actually in Liverpool. They'd never the group of children I worked with in Speak, which is one of the most, kind of, in terms of labels, one of the most deprived areas in Europe, and access to nature being very, very low. But, you know, it probably took me an hour or two of working with this group of children and their dads. So the project was around gardening, and we hit upon the idea of grow your own Christmas dinner. So, you know, that was great because it was tangible, it didn't feel intimidating, they'd never done gardening before, it wasn't immediately about plants, it was about food, and it was about, you know, food that had a really kind of strong cultural association. So I think there's always a way in to an individual or a group, a community, which behind it might be, and in that example, we turned the front area of the Shore Start Centre into an abundant space of food growing, and you know, the families involved stay involved, which was quite rare in those particular groups that the centre were running, and by, you know, at the end of it, we cooked together. So I think they learnt a lot about soil and kind of the construction of those beds, but plants and seasons and everything that you would want, almost like the starter kit for having a relationship with nature, if you've never had that. And I just think it's almost like simplifying what you're doing as a gardener, especially if you're engaged in community. I don't know if that rings any bells with you, Jack.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, the conversation with the community is the biggest part. I mean, we had instances where we were kind of trying to fix what they were destroying, but when I was talking with them and with the clients, I said, well, we're kind of not getting anywhere because we keep fixing, they keep destroying it, right? We're not getting, but, and then I start, well, what about just talking with them, you know, like, it's not a big deal. So I never thought I would be the diplomatic advocate for these things, but I ended up, you know, having to be, you know, I'm being Italian, you know, I tend to be kind of emotional about things, so I have to kind of, you know, be calm and just talk with them. And we had two communities in particular. One was a Southern American community, and one was the Eastern European community. And we just wanted to understand, like, for instance, they will gather in an area and just drink all night, but then leave all the trash behind. And they will keep cleaning every weekend. After the weekend was a huge mess. So I thought, well, that's not really getting us anywhere, right? And I think, well, we tried kind of start talking to them. And then because they really like the place, obviously they meet there every weekend to drink. Obviously they enjoy the place. Mm. So, you know, we started kind of talking to them and just saying, you know, we are trying to create it interesting also for you, right? We don't want you to go away. We just want you to realize how much work it is if you, and we have provided bins, we have everything. So very slowly, basically, being diplomatic very slowly and not being top down, like kind of, you know, sitting down with them and just having a chat and just understanding. Some spoke very little English, for instance, you know. So it was kind of interesting that to start, because they always congregate because they talk in their language and they have their own community. And we had kind of an area with logs where they felt really like under the trees. They felt really the perfect place. But coming back to them, I don't think they were resistant. I don't think they knew or they thought about the challenges and the disruption maybe they were creating. Mm. So, or maybe just the mess they were, you know, they were not perceived because it was public, you know, it was a given. But when we started talking, it's getting better. It's not getting solved, but I think it's getting better. So talking with them and just be on their level, just trying to see if we can find a solution, because ultimately they also want a nice park, so we want, and so the client. So we are all kind of, we want the same, but just how to get there. Yeah. I think the most challenging probably are teenagers, male teenagers. I think the hormones are all over, and they have kind of a powerful need to use tools, and you know, I don't think I'm not that successful yet with that age group, but with others, and yes, we're getting there. So yeah.
And Adam, I'm sure you had some fascinating conversations at Chelsea with people coming to your garden, and not everyone was receptive, I imagine. How did you deal with that side of things?
Nearly all the people that spoke to us were really positive. We obviously got some, there was there was some pushback in the press, but that was around a strange thing. It was sort of, was it a garden? Was it a landscape or was it a garden? You know, it was around the Chelsea criteria. I don't think anyone had a problem with the garden as such. I mean, the thing I wanted to talk about was we come. I mean, Alistair put this video up in his talk with the Welsh farmer, and quite a number of our projects are in rural areas, and a lot of landowners and farmers feel very strongly about rewilding, and actually rural communities as well, where fox hunting is and shooting and these kind of things are part of the rural fabric. And I've heard comments similar to that, drinking your latte in your ivory tower, Alistair. You know, it's not unusual. But I think that's an important community to engage with as well. And these are the landowners and the people that grow the food and the people that keep the countryside as it is. And I think having conversations with them, pointing out the benefits, financial assistance from the government, those kind of things are going to help us. But they all know, when you speak to everyone that I speak to in a rural community who's involved with agriculture, they know that something has to change, but it is potentially scary, you know. And so we're talking to farmers. We went to one beaver site where they magically arrived. No one knows how they got there, but there was a dam that was probably 85 meters long above a rural community that had sort of 20 odd houses, maybe I think it was 30, built on the floodplain. And flooding, they were having less flooding events since this dam had gone in. In other locations within the southwest, the Environment Agency has been spending huge amounts of money to build permeable dams out of concrete, when they could put a beaver in, it would do just the same. And the good thing about the beavers is if they put the dam in the wrong place, you can remove it, and they don't get upset. They just try again, and then they get bored of trying, and they go somewhere else. So it's these small wins that are on a local community level that I think we need to be talking about, and also understanding that it is really scary for people whose livelihood feels threatened. There were similar discussions around farmers' markets in a funny way. You know, the NFU saying, farmers' markets going to make any difference to farming in England? Well, sort of 20 years on, yes, they did actually. They helped 10% sort of small holdings really succeed, and I think it's similar to that. But to keep having these dialogues, and then coming back to this thing that surely we want our children and our grandchildren to be able to bump into a beaver or an otter or a badger or a fox, or see a flying V of ducks or geese in the evenings. Those are the things. That's why we're doing it. It's just that awe, that beauty that we want.
Yeah.
Yeah, witnessing nature.
Oh.
Right?
I think maybe we waived that now. It's been a fascinating chat, and I think our time is now up and it's time for a break. But thank you so much to my panellists today, Adam, Giacomo and Gemma. Thank you.